Well, Dr. Collins, I actually am familiar with some of your books and own several of them. I was going to try to arrange them all right here behind me so it would look like we're Francis Collins devotees, but
a little bit set up, I'm afraid.
That's right. Well, I'm going to ask you basically the first question is you could probably say, well, just refer to my book about, coming to peace with science. But I'd just love to briefly, if you could, give us a word on the charge that a lot of our people hear a lot, which is that the scientific methodology precludes its adherents from embracing faith. Like somehow in thinking through rationally that the idea that somebody could believe in Jesus is precluded. Could you just speak to that for a minute?
Sure. So science is a very powerful way to understand the natural world. That's what science is designed to do, and it's very successful at that. And a number of discoveries, particularly these days in biology, that are coming out of the scientific approach are really dizzying in their scope, and I think can be considered generally reliable. But science is completely unable to address things that fall outside of the natural realm of things. So, for instance, it would be a complete category error to take the tools of science and try to decide whether God exists. God being outside of nature is not really a subject to scientific investigation. Similarly, the resurrection as a miracle that I believe in passionately as a believer in Jesus Christ is not a subject that science is able to say much about, because that would be a suspension of the natural laws. But one can certainly say if there is a God, and I believe there is, and if God is the author of those natural laws, then there's no reason God can't suspend them at moments of great import to the message to his people.
So you feel like the scientific methodology, like Bart Ehrman is a famous scholar around here, is a New Testament scholar, and he says that the historical methodology, you are not allowed to actually entertain the idea of a miracle. Now, some people respond back to that and say, well, that's kind of being closed-minded from the beginning. Would you agree with that?
I would. Read C.S. Lewis's wonderful book called Miracles. In the first page, I think it sort of makes this point that there are two ways to make miracles irrelevant. One is to decide ahead of time that there can't be any, in which case, no matter what evidence is provided, you won't accept it. The other is to attach the word miracle to things that actually we understand scientifically, like the fact that that flower has a particularly beautiful red color, or the sunset has a particular nice pink appearance to it this evening. So we shouldn't fall into either of those traps. But I think an open-minded approach to the question would allow the possibility that natural laws, while they apply most of the time, could in fact be suspended at moments of special import by the author of those natural laws, namely God himself.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Thank you, Dr. Collins. By the way, my name is JD, and you,
Okay, JD.
I think in my rush to get to this, skipped over some of the preliminaries. Richard Dawkins, in his book God Delusion, made a statement that I thought was, I couldn't, well, I'll go ahead and tell you, I 90% think I agree with it, although I'm not entirely sure. I just want to get your reaction to it. He said that the argument is not between creation and evolution. The argument is between the natural and the supernatural. Do you agree with that statement?
I think that's correct, actually, because I am somebody who sees that evolution is in fact very well supported by the scientific evidence that tells us, particularly from the study of DNA, the descent from a common ancestor appears to be true, and that gradual change over time by different changes in DNA acted upon by natural selection is capable of producing a very wonderful diversity of living things. But I also believe there's a creator behind all of this. So as Dennis Alexander's recent book, Creation or Evolution, Do You Have to Choose? That's the title of the book. I would say the answer is no. You can have them both. In fact, I think it's a very reasonable position to say both are true. The real question then is the creation part of this allowed to extend outside of the purely naturalistic, materialistic approach? And my answer to that would be yes, that science doesn't help you with that, but other arguments, such as why are we all here anyway, and such things as the fact the universe had a beginning, which doesn't otherwise have an easy explanation, cry out for a creator who's outside of nature, i.e. supernatural.
Mm-hmm. How does intelligent design play into that? Because I'll be honest with you, I'm not sure. Like, I've read Dembski and Behe and a lot of those guys, and then when in the language of God, I felt like there were definitely some points of commonality between what you said and what intelligent design theorists said, but obviously there are some points of disagreement there too.
Well, first of all, there's a semantic issue here. What is intelligent design anyway, and what are the principles of it? I believe in little I, intelligent, little d, design, in the sense that I believe God is the greatest intelligence that one could possibly imagine and designed the universe to give rise to creatures like us with whom God could have fellowship, granting us the free gifts of a soul and the knowledge of right and wrong and all of those things that make us human. So yeah, intelligent design sounds pretty good. The problem is that the way intelligent design is currently used by those attached to the ID movement is a very specialized version of that, and a rather narrow one actually. Basically saying evolution is not sufficient to account for some of the very complex nanomachines that we have located within our bodies and that we see in other living organisms as well. They're just too fancy, too complicated. Evolution wouldn't be able to produce those kinds of protein machines. And frankly, that hypothesis, which was kind of interesting 10 years ago, is I think now in real trouble. The things that evolution has been able to produce over the course of the past hundreds of millions of years do in fact fit pretty nicely with Darwin's theory and don't require these supernatural interventions that ID proponents seem to argue are necessary. Take the bacterial flagellum, which is the poster child for ID, this amazing little outboard motor that bacteria have that allow them to zip around. It does look like a pretty difficult contraption for gradual stepwise evolution and natural selection to generate, because it's got 32 different proteins, and if any one of them doesn't work, the whole thing doesn't work. But now we've studied a lot more bacteria, we can actually see that those components were recruited from other uses. They didn't have to be derived out of nothingness. And then you begin to see how this fits rather nicely with the gradual stepwise process that Darwin described. And there's no need, therefore, to insert a requirement of a supernatural intervention. In that regard, ID, capital I, capital D, really now falls, in my view, into a God of the gaps theory that inserts God into places that science hadn't quite explained. Well, science is starting to explain them. So what have we done? We've made God too small.
Right. So it's almost like we set up some pillars on which God stands, and when they get knocked away, people feel like they've knocked out the belief in God, which is not necessary.
Well, that's exactly right. And I think, J.D., that's the point that causes many of us concern about ID, is that despite its initial appeal and the fact that many churches have embraced it as an alternative to what is seen as naturalistic, atheistic evolution, it is not a perspective that has a healthy future.
Right.
Because as the principles of ID do gradually turn out to be mistaken, then people who had sort of staked their faith on this being the answer are suddenly cast into great confusion. Better to have those of us with faith in our churches attach themselves to a broader view of God's creative genius without having to limit it in this way. Because ID is not only bad science, it's actually bad theology. It makes God out to be a sort of an underachiever who got evolution started, but it didn't quite work. I have to fix this and this and this, and millions of times fixing the system because it wasn't really good enough to achieve the goal. That doesn't sound like God, the creator that I have worshipped.
Right.